Good evening, YouTube, and welcome to the first ever Crazy Corner stream, I guess. My name's James. I'm crazy, and I'm in a corner. So, my plan essentially is I'm going to make this channel, and I'm going to watch videos on YouTube regarding mental health or maybe other things, depending on how I feel, and try and help people with their problems, because I'm in a unique position where I've been through it. I've had mental health problems my whole life. I can help lots and lots of people out there, and debunk a lot of rubbish that people say, a lot of stigmas, myths, incorrect truths, and we'll all learn a lot, including myself, along the way. You know, I might know a lot, but I'm sure I'll learn a lot along the way. So onwards we go with the mental health journey. Let me just have a look and make sure this is all looking good on YouTube. So onwards we go with the mental health journey. So I'm going to search mental health help, right? And we'll go from there. I don't need help. I'm actually fine. But, oh, look at that. You are not alone. If you are someone you're having a hard time, talk to Samaritans. Well, I'm not suicidal. Mental health isn't always suicide. The show... What? Mental... Oh, this would be interesting. Psychiatrists, the people with God complexes and superiority complexes that they're better than everyone else. And they know everyone's brain's better than them. Interesting.
I'm psychiatrist Dr. Eric Bender. Let's answer your questions from the internet. This is mental health support. At Pink Penguin writes, someone please educate me. What does psychotic mean? Psychotic means a break from reality. You are experiencing things that other people might not be. That can include auditory hallucinations, hearing things other people might not be hearing, visual hallucinations, although those are rarer. You might have delusions, fixed false beliefs you believe are true despite other people showing you evidence that those aren't true. Psychotic does not mean someone is going to commit crimes. At Andrea H. Perez, how does depression make you
Move it a
exhausted
bit.
and
There we
sometimes
go.
too sad
That's
to fall
better.
asleep? When you're depressed,
Settle
your
in for this
circadian
streamer.
rhythms are off. In fact, one of the first things we ask patients about is sleep. People don't realize that they have this picture that when you're depressed, you might sleep more, but in fact, it's the opposite. You wake up early, and people are like, why am I waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning, not even setting an alarm? It's because your sleep cycle has been phase shifted or phase advanced. You go to bed earlier, and you wake up earlier. We think this has to do with a lack of neurotransmitters when you're depressed. So there's less serotonin, norepinephrine, and there's less acetylcholine. And for some reason, this makes us wake up early. At Atten Supreme, anyone else think stress is contagious? I'll tell you, watching high school students
Stress
in
is
the Bay
definitely
Area go through
contagious.
the college application process, I can absolutely tell you it is contagious. There was a study that looked at an audience watching a speech being given by someone who was very anxious. Saliva samples were then gathered from the audience as well as the presenter. The saliva had increased cortisol levels, which is that stress hormone, not only in the presenter, but in the audience. So stress is absolutely contagious. At Say Baby is asking, can depression be hypnotized out of you? No. Hypnotherapy is very effective for some things. It can help people with smoking cessation. It can help people decrease their temper. Sometimes hypnotherapy can also be used to treat sleep disorders and insomnia. It cannot change the level of neurotransmitters in your brain that are correlated with depression. Some people are more hypnotizable than others. When you look at this eye roll chart, it gives you a sense of a gradient, how
Guess I'll sit up
hypnotizable
properly.
someone might be. You ask them to look up into their head. When they're looking straight ahead, That's a 0. Then 1 is slightly, you start to see a little bit of white. Then you start to see more white. The scale goes all the way down to 4, being you see mostly white, almost exorcist style. There is a correlation between those that show a lot of white when they roll their eyes and being able to be hypnotized easily. DJ Leapcard asks, what's the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist, and which one do I need to see? Well, a psychiatrist has gone to medical school, so they can prescribe medications. If you're feeling overwhelmed and need to talk to somebody, a therapist would be fine. That could be a psychologist or a psychiatrist. If there's suspicion that medication is needed, then a psychiatrist is the one you'd want to see. At Bellmaps wants to know, question for psychiatrists, counselors, how do you not cry? Well, at Bellmaps, to be honest, sometimes I do get tearful with patients. We are human after all, even though some people don't think we are. At Mets4Nin33, do personality disorders work on a spectrum? Like, can you have mild disorder of narcissism? Absolutely, there's a spectrum here. You can absolutely have narcissistic traits. When it's unhealthy is when you start to think only of yourself.
A good point about like everything being on a spectrum, like depression's on a spectrum, schizophrenia is on a spectrum. My personal belief is that ADHD is kind of in the anxiety spectrum a little bit, and then right at the extreme is schizophrenia. Like the ultimate distractions, not just a lot of them, but ultimate distractions on top of that. Whereas everyone, at some point in their life, everyone hears someone say their name that isn't there. Like someone will say your name, and you're in the middle of nowhere. You're in the middle of a field. There's no one around you, and you heard someone say your name. Everyone at some point in their life will experience this. They hear something that no one else could hear, or that they think they could hear that no one else could hear. And that's, just imagine that 24 hours a day, 24 hours like for your whole life. That's schizophrenia.
Yourself, fantasies and obsessions over unlimited power or beauty. And then the full-blown disorder, you could go as far as to be a malignant narcissist. You have a lack of empathy and don't really care about other people. This is where we find psychopaths. At Resilience Doc, how do you think the brain-gut connection works? Preclinical data, meaning data and research from animals, not people, shows that there's a relationship between the brain, the gut, and the microbiota, or the bacteria that populate your gut. What we found was that in some
he looks like the kind of guy who'd be a psychiatrist, like glasses, waistcoat, tie. I mean, his hair's pretty stylish for a psychiatrist, I'll give him that.
Stress-induced rodents, they ended up having short-chain fatty acids, and what we find is there's actually less serotonin produced in the stress-induced rodent's guts. Now, that's not the same serotonin that's in your brain. Yes, it's the same structure, but that serotonin in your gut doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. However, what we find is that the inflammation that is caused during the stress causes the vagus nerve, which is involved in depression, to not fire the way it's supposed to. And so as a result, this inflammation might have something to do with a depressive state. It suggests that with a healthy gut and healthy microbiome, we can actually have improved mood. Okay, next question. At Dariz Nobot wants to know, when did psychiatry start? Well, formal psychiatry can be traced back to the 19th century. We used to have a group of doctors called
modern psychiatry, yes.
And their job was to understand and treat and be with people.
Let's be honest, the beginning of psychiatry and psychology is philosophy. Like, I don't care what he says. The study of modern psychiatry, yes, probably about the 50s, after the war, because everyone wanted to understand post-traumatic stress disorder, because everyone was coming back from the war shell-shocked with post-traumatic stress disorder, running around having hallucinations and delusions and scaring people, being dangerous sometimes. They wanted to understand why, and that's why modern psychiatry and psychology was born. But essentially, psychiatry and modern psychology all stems from ancient philosophy. You could argue religion, I guess, as well, but I'd say philosophy.
People who had an alienation from the rest of society that was due to mental health issues. In 1895, Freud wrote Studies in Hysteria. Some consider that the birth of psychoanalysis. Why does no one talk about how depression and anxiety can cause major memory loss? Depression really can make us have memory issues. What we think that has to do with is a lack of glutamate. Glutamate is the excitatory neurotransmitter, and when there's less of that, we find that people don't lay down memory.
Right,
processing speed of somebody with a depressed mind can be 40% below what it is when they're not depressed. There's something called pseudo-dementia, in fact, this false appearance of dementia, but it could in fact be a depression. At MaggieMeg26, have you ever had a random ass thought that just won't leave your head? I'm going through it right now. First off, Every human being has a random ass thought. If we don't want them, they're called intrusive. And then they can become obsessive if you can't let go of it. And that's when it can start to go into the obsessive compulsive disorder range. So the obsessive thought pathway starts with the connection between the orbitofrontal cortex. It goes back to these areas here called the basal ganglia. When that pathway is activated, there's a worry, but then the inhibitory pathway goes back to the orbitofrontal cortex and actually shuts it down. It inhibits it. In someone with an obsessive thought disorder where they keep worrying about the same thing, there's overactivation of that direct pathway back and underactivation of the inhibitory pathway. It's like there's no brakes to stop this worry. So we have this cycle that goes on and on and on and on. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is used to help somebody with these kind of obsessions. You can also do something called exposure and response therapy. That's where you make a hierarchy of fears. Let's say somebody's fearful of spiders. First rung on that hierarchy of fears might be, all right, let's talk about spiders. The next thing might be going to the tarantula exhibit. And the last thing might be petting spiders and letting them crawl all
Not
over.
for you, dog. No.
Amy is asking, why does TikTok keep telling me I have ADHD? TikTok's going to tell you a lot of things. Please do not look at TikTok as your sole source of information for mental health. A study looking at 500 videos on...
I agree with that. Also, don't trust everything a psychiatrist says about mental health. I mean, this one sec, I'll finish eating. It's a bit rude. Yeah. So he seems like a perfectly decent, reasonable man, but there are psychiatrists and psychologists out there who essentially treat their patients like experiments, using medication they know won't cure them just to make their symptoms better, to then analyse the results. Not because it's going to help them, because it'll ease the symptoms, but they're supposed to be helping treat the illness, not the symptoms. So then they make money off the suffering of mentally disabled people, sometimes for decades, under this illusion that they're helping them, when actually the whole time they were hindering them and making money off it. I know it sounds ridiculous, but even 30, 40 years ago, I mean, think back to the 80s, the 70s, they were literally chopping people's brains in half in the name of helping them. Like, come on. Most people who are psychiatrists and psychologists are about as well educated in mental health as you can get, but that's like the same as the man who first created the first man-made fire knows about the combustion engine. They know nothing. They know nothing. They get mentally disabled people and they do their best, but they're very limited. Very limited.
On TikTok with the hashtags mental health tips and mental health advice showed that about 84% were misleading, about 31% had inaccurate information, and 14% had information that was damaging. Only 9% of the people doing the videos even had relevant qualifications to do the videos. As a society right now, our brains are being trained to be stimulated for only a few seconds and to go to the next thing and to go to the next thing and to go to the next thing. I think people find
people like that are losers.
Focusing, it's not ADHD.
That is literally a drug addiction. If you need a hit of something exciting every few seconds, that's no different to like a heroin addict or a pot smoker or a cocaine addict. It's no different. Like the TikTok addicts are basically drug addicts, essentially.
Maybe it's being on TikTok too long. At Mendy, I wish there was more information.
Like you get World of Warcraft addicts, like RuneScape addicts, Facebook addicts, TikTok addicts, YouTube addicts. You can be addicted to anything: sex, alcohol, tobacco, like drinking too much water. I mean, you can drown yourself.
Available on how shrooms can help manage PTSD, anxiety.
Hey, go lie down. Go on.
Go lie down. Coming. There is a lot of promise that shrooms or mushrooms can actually help with PTSD or with depression. What we're talking about when we talk about shrooms is really psilocybin, a chemical that binds to the serotonin receptor, particularly in the thalamus, so that we have these hallucinations. But what's interesting is it's not the hallucinatory experience that necessarily is the treatment. There's a case report of a man who did have a psilocybin-guided treatment. He didn't have the psychedelic experience and was actually kind of disappointed he didn't. But 40% of his depressive symptoms went away based on his reports and the structured evaluations that he was given. There's something about having a guided treatment, something about having somebody there with you. can be really helpful and really powerful. It shows us that there's really a value to being interconnected with each other. At Hexbags, am I having a panic attack? Heart attack? Heartburn? Weird chest pain? What is it? Cry emoji, cry emoji. A panic attack is abrupt. It comes out of nowhere. You can have chest tightness, difficulty breathing. It can feel like your throat's constricting. You might have sweaty hands or sweat all over and maybe some pain. So it feels like you're gonna have a heart attack. That anxiety peaks after a certain number of minutes and then it comes down, but you're so worked up and so worried that absolutely you feel panicked. There's also something called an anxiety attack. Maybe you're giving a presentation, maybe you have to take a test, you get more and more anxious and you feel like you can't go on. That's an anxiety.
If, like me, you suffer in silence and tend to bottle all your emotions up, then you know how bad it can be.
Anxiety attack. At Tune of Your Death wants to know, help, I'm having an anxiety attack in the middle of class. Sad face. What do I do? Help. You can do a grounding technique. Remind yourself where you are and what you're doing. I'm here, I'm sitting in the room. There are people around me. Some people go by the rule of 3-3-3. See 3 things, hear 3 things, and move 3 parts of your body. A common thing people say is just breathe. That is not helpful. I never find that helpful to say just breathe. A good breathing technique is actually inhaling through your nose and exhaling for twice as long. So you can inhale.
That's no good if you have a deviated septum.
Inhale for, say, a count of 3, and exhale for a count of 6. It's the exhale that's actually relaxing. At Angel Disrupted, I'll be honest, I don't know the difference between serotonin or dopamine or oxytocin or endorphins, and at this point, I'm too afraid to ask. Endorphins are hormones. Endorphin comes from the name endogenous, meaning it's made inside us, and morphine, which is a painkiller, and the endorphins imitate what morphine does. That runner's high comes from endorphins. Serotonin and dopamine are neurotransmitters. They transmit messages in the brain. Serotonin has to do with mood and anxiety, and dopamine has to do with joy, pleasure, and sometimes even motivation or attention. Serotonin is implicated in depression and anxiety when it's low, and dopamine can also be low in depression and in ADHD. Oxytocin is that loving or bonding hormone. In women, when they breastfeed, that actually helps form a loving relationship with the child. At Anxiety Aloner says, has anyone tried fish oil or omega-3 supplements for mental health? It's meant to be good for anxiety and depression. Did you notice any difference? Omega-3 fatty acids increase blood flow in the brain. Now, this doesn't necessarily correlate to improvements in mood, but some people do report improvements in mood, and that omega-3s can actually help with depression, even with ADHD. There's a population that will respond to that, and they'll be able to concentrate more. You can take 1 gram or up to 2 grams, but studies show that going up to 4 grams doesn't really do anything. 1 gram is the equivalent of having salmon meals maybe 3 times a week. You could get fish burps, though. Just be aware of that. At Ryder Trilla writes, I would love to know what triggers schizophrenia. Like, actually study that shit. We do know that now there are over 200
I'm a schizophrenic. This should be interesting.
genes responsible for schizophrenia. And what happens is if you have enough errors in those 200 genes, you might develop schizophrenia. Even in schizophrenia, and something we know has strong genetic component to it, there are environmental factors. And we know this from studies of twins. If one twin develops schizophrenia, there's a 1 in 2 chance the other will, but it's not 100%, suggesting there's something in the environment. What might unlock that could be substance use. It could be trauma. We're still trying to figure out the connections.
Usually it's either head trauma, childhood abuse, or loss of life, stress, anxiety, these sorts of things. If you crack an egg enough, it breaks.
Between these, what is the environmental factor exactly? What genes are turned on exactly? Here's another one. How does stress work? How do you destroy the freeze response? When we face stress, there's a section of the brain called the amygdala, a nuclei, a collection of cells. That senses a threat and sends a message to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus
This is
gets
getting
the
boring.
body ready to make
Boring.
adrenaline or cortisol, which allows us to have that fight or flight response. Are we going to get ready to stand up to this threat, or are we going to take off? What can also happen is another response called the freeze response. A collection of cells that senses a threat and sends a message. Destroying the freeze response would probably involve some cognitive behavioral therapy or other types of therapy where you talk about what is it that is keeping you frozen in place. At Lifting Humanity, can depression be beaten or only managed? Absolutely, depression can be beaten. I have seen people have depression in what's called remission. It's not coming back again. What happens in depression is that we have low
Peppa Pig. Oh, that's my daughter's search. That's funny. Okay. Right, what should we search next? Let's have a think. What's trending? This is boring. Really boring. This is what all these people are watching. Look at this, right? I know I'm a weirdo, but so we've got nearly 1 million people who have watched someone who's fixed the Lamborghini problem. Right? We've got 3.1 million people celebrating that streamer's birthday, or his stream's anniversary, I guess. 2 million people watching the Raw highlights. Football, okay, that's fair enough. It just seems like people don't watch anything to do with mental health. Like, there's nothing to do with mental health here. Look. People just don't care. That's the sad truth. People just don't care. Well, I guess that's a good video to start with. I will be building this channel up and making more videos. It's just the start, you know. It's just trying to figure out how to best to help people out there. The only way is to try and reach them and do it. So